1,120 words. The champagne had already been popped by the time I arrived, and the backyard was buzzing with relatives I hadn't seen since the last obligatory family gathering. Streamers in navy and gold, the unofficial Vale family colors, hung from the sycamores like we were celebrating a military commission. My brother Camden, in a crisp suit and power tie, stood by the fire pit, his arm around our father Everett, who looked as proud as if Camden had just been sworn in as governor. The banner strung across the back fence read, "Congratulations, Camden, a voice for justice." I slipped in unnoticed through the side gate. That's how I usually arrived at these things, quietly, deliberately, and as invisible as I needed to be. My cousin Maura was the first to spot me. She sashayed over with a glass of white wine that looked more like lemon water. "Seraphine, I didn't know you were coming." Her smile was tight, her tone looser. "We were just saying it's been, 3 Christmases?" "Something like that," I said. I smiled, even though she wasn't wrong. Most years I found a work crisis, or rather an actual national crisis, to keep me away. She looked me over the way people do when they can't decide whether you're a mystery or a mess. Still doing that tech volunteering must be fulfilling. She said the word the way someone might say composting. "Busy as ever," I replied. Before she could ask more, I heard my mother's voice carry over from the patio. She sat in a wicker chair surrounded by women who wore the same soft pearls and muted floral patterns that marked respectable retirement. They were laughing over something, and then I caught it, her voice airy and sweet. "Seraphine. She works with non-profits, I think. Something to do with computers. She doesn't really explain it." A pause. Still figuring things out. The laugh that followed was subtle but familiar. I'd heard versions of it for over a decade. My mother never intended to sound cruel, but she'd perfected the art of disappointment coded in manners. I turned back to the snack table and pretended to fuss with the guacamole. For context, my name is Seraphine Vale, and I am 36 years old. I'm a senior systems architect with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CySA for short, under the Department of Homeland Security. My job building and overseeing defense protocols that protect critical U.S. infrastructure from nation-state cyberattacks. Electrical grids, emergency services, the banking system, water. You name it, I've helped defend it. But no one outside my world is supposed to know that. Which is why, to my family, I'm just a tech-savvy woman with too much education and too little clarity. A perpetual question mark, a curiosity, or worse, a failure with good posture. "Seraphine," my dad called out, waving a glass. "Come toast your brother." The whole crowd turned toward Camden. Local officials, state bar members, even a reporter from Channel 4 hovered nearby. My mother stood by, hand on Camden's back like she was presenting a prize ribbon at the county fair. I drifted toward the crowd but stayed toward the back behind a row of uncles who hadn't remembered my birthday since 2008. As I found a spot near the hydrangeas, my phone buzzed once against my hip. I glanced down. Critical alert grid, East Coast threat level orange. The encrypted notice glowed on my secure channel. Not spam at all. My jaw tightened. It meant we had less than an hour to assess potential intrusion probes on the Eastern power grid. Possible testing by hostile actors. Could be a dry run, could be something more. But first, the toast. My father raised his glass. "Today we recognize a man of honor, dedication, and clear vision, my son Camden. A public servant in every sense of the word." He smiled toward him. "One of our children has found his calling. The other," he glanced toward me. The crowd, turning slightly, is still exploring. And that's okay too. Laughter, applause, glasses clinking. I could feel the heat rush up the back of my neck, but I didn't move. I'd been here before, many times. I looked down at my phone again. Response team mobilizing. Lead assigned Vale. Great. I turned toward the gate. Needed to move now. Needed to reach secure comms in 20 minutes. Leaving already, Maura called from behind me, her smile wide. "Did someone unplug a router? I've got work," I said flatly. "Work?" my Uncle Frank snorted. "Since when does unpaid computer tinkering count as work?" I didn't respond. Just walked out. The gate clicked behind me, and I stepped into the early evening light, pulling my keys from my purse and unlocking my car in one motion. 15 minutes later, I was in a parking garage 2 towns over, connected to a secure tunnel via my secondary device. My dashboard read 92 degrees outside, but inside the encrypted system things were heating faster. "Veil online," I said, typing in my ID string. Seraphine came my division chief's voice, clipped and serious. "We've got coordinated probes on at least 5 substations. Potential breach. Homeland wants a full-tier protocol by dawn. Your lead on response ops." "Copy that," I said. As I pulled up the preliminary metrics satellite ping logs and traced the origin IP clusters, the sound of that backyard toast looped back in my head. Still exploring, still invisible, still underestimated. But that was okay, because sometimes the best place to lead from is behind the firewall. They called me a dropout. I was actually in a basement at the NSA building defense protocols that never made the news because they were never supposed to. I didn't leave college because I couldn't handle it. I left because someone in a suit handed me a black envelope in a quiet hallway and said, "What you see in systems most people miss. We'd like to talk to you. Somewhere else. But let's rewind." I was 16 when I arrived at MIT. Not a prodigy in the peacocking way. Some kids were no flashy science fair trophies or viral code that made me famous online. I was more of a shadow-efficient, curious and invisible. The kind of person who found the error logs no one thought to check, the kind who rewrote simulations just to see if they'd break under stress. While other students pulled all-nighters cramming for calculus, I was running anomaly models for fun on the campus network. For me, math was a language and code was poetry that never lied. At the time, I lived in the sub-basement of a converted brownstone on Vassar Street with a roommate named Mel, a robotics major who once asked dead serious if she could borrow my brain for a day. Mel was loud and brilliant and rarely wore matching socks. She liked to joke that I was a tech monk, always at my keyboard headphones and solving puzzles no one else cared about. What I didn't tell Mel was that the thing I was working on, this just-for-fun side project, had started drawing strange attention. A paper I'd posted anonymously to a niche cybersecurity forum had been quietly flagged. It outlined a vulnerability in how 3 major U.S. infrastructure systems handled low-level authentication. Basically, I'd found a way in. Not to exploit it, but to patch it. I never thought anyone important would read it. I was wrong. One Wednesday afternoon, I was called into a professor's office under the pretense of department recognition. That's when I met Agent Kilroy. He didn't say what agency he was from. He wore a charcoal suit, black shoes, and had a smile that never touched his eyes. On the table in front of him was a plain black folder. No logos, no names, just my paper printed and annotated. He didn't ask many questions. Instead, he told me what they'd noticed. How my logic chains jumped 5 steps ahead of standard models. How my encryption pattern used entropy curves nobody else in the field had thought to manipulate. Then he asked me if I wanted to do more than solve puzzles for class credit. That's how it began. No oath, no ceremony. Just a car ride to a windowless building in Maryland where a woman named Dr. Vance handed me a lanyard and a coffee, then took me to a room full of screens. "Welcome to the sandbox," she said. "We're the people who keep things running when the lights should have gone out." For the next 2 years, I worked under multiple names behind multiple firewalls. At 19, I had 3 active security clearances. I lived in a government-owned condo with no address, carried a phone that never rang unless someone in Langley needed me, and reported to a task force no one outside of 6 agencies had clearance to discuss. My work never made headlines. That's how I knew I was doing it right. Meanwhile, back home, my parents told people I had burned out, dropped out of MIT after too much pressure. My mother cried on the phone, asked if I needed to come home. My father didn't speak to me for 2 months. "She could have had such a future," he told a friend once I heard about it through an aunt. "Now she's just wasting that mind." I didn't correct them. At first, I thought it would only be temporary. That one day I'd be able to say, "This is where I was, what I was doing, who I was helping." But the nature of the job hardened. The stakes got higher. The attacks became real. Cities went dark because of code, and hospitals lost power in the middle of surgery. My work shifted from simulation to live defense, and every line of code I wrote might buy someone else 5 more minutes to evacuate, to reroute, to survive. So I stayed. Quiet, effective, hidden. Dr. Vance became something like a mentor. She never asked about my family, never offered comfort. But she did pull me aside one night after a particularly brutal simulation failure, one that, had it been real, could have taken down a telecom grid on the East Coast. She said, "They'll never know what you do. They'll never thank you, but they'll live because of it. Learn to be okay with that." I wrote that line in my notebook that night and underlined it twice. By the time I was 24, I'd contributed to 3 classified threat models used by FEMA, had written 2 modules that were permanently installed in the National Banking Protection Layer, and had a seat, albeit behind a screen, on the Cyber Risk Council that met quarterly with Homeland Security. But when my mother mailed out the annual Christmas letter, she said I was pursuing non-profit work and keeping busy. It wasn't her fault. That's all she was allowed to know. And the truth was, I hadn't just erased my online profile. I'd erased my personal one too. I didn't date, didn't call home unless necessary. I couldn't afford to slip, not when every piece of personal information could become a vector. At family reunions, I learned to smile vaguely, to speak in generalities. Still working in tech, doing some consulting, helping with infrastructure. They never asked more. They were bored with me by then. That was fine, because I knew what I was doing, who I was protecting, and that had to be enough. Until now. Until last night, when the President of the United States said my name on national television, and suddenly, hiding was no longer an option. The roast chicken hadn't even been carved when my father tossed a thick folder onto the center of the dining table with a loud thump. Pages fluttered out the side. My mother winced, but didn't say anything she knew better than to interrupt Everett Vale when he was holding court. "Have either of you seen this?" he asked, tapping the document with 2 fingers like it had insulted him personally. It was a printout of the newly proposed Cyber Infrastructure Act, fresh from a Senate subcommittee. I recognized the format immediately. I'd helped write half of it. Not my name, of course. The work had been submitted through a classified legislative advisory channel, known only to a few federal liaisons. It was designed that way, faceless input from national defense contributors embedded into the civilian legal process. A firewall of people like me, keeping our names off the record while shaping the spine of how the country protects itself. Camden reached for the folder, skimming the first few pages. "God," he muttered, eyebrows rising. "They want to let CISA draft response guidelines with only post hoc judicial oversight. That's sloppy." "Sloppy," my father scoffed. "It's an outright circumvention of due process. They're handing emergency powers to unelected tech people, probably folks with 0 courtroom experience." I took a slow sip of my water. Everett continued, energized now. "It reads like it was written by someone who's never stepped foot in a courtroom. Legal Swiss cheese. You give an agency too much discretionary power, and suddenly you've got bureaucrats pulling wires in the name of security. This entire thing is a mess." Camden nodded. "I mean, yeah. If I were drafting this, half of it wouldn't make it past my first-year law interns." I placed my fork down gently on my plate and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't look at the draft again. I didn't need to. I remembered every clause, every subpoint, every bit of careful phrasing we'd agonized over to balance speed of response with legal guardrails. I remembered the 4-hour Zoom call with a defense policy liaison who'd lost her father during a delayed cyber attack response in Texas last year. I remembered why we had written the bill this way, and I remembered what we were trying to prevent. Everett turned to me finally. "Seraphine, this is your world, isn't it? What do you think of this thing?" I smiled slightly. "It's complicated," he snorted. "That's what people say when they don't have an answer." "I didn't say I didn't have one," I replied evenly. "I said it's complicated. Balancing operational response with judicial oversight is always going to create friction." "You sound like one of the authors," he said, narrowing his eyes. "But someone who doesn't understand real constitutional limits." Camden chuckled. "She's probably just heard too much of the tech side's fear-mongering. If we don't act now, the grid will fall tomorrow." It's always the same narrative. Funny, I said softly, because sometimes it's true. Neither of them noticed. Instead, Everett turned the page and jabbed his finger at a specific paragraph. This section here, about automatic asset mobilization protocols. It's absurd. No judge, no warrant, just a toggle flipped by a DHS official with an engineering degree. I said nothing, because the truth was I had written that section. Me, the woman sitting across from him in a black sweater eating overcooked vegetables while being told with great certainty how little I knew about the world I operated in daily. I felt my stomach tighten, not with shame, but with restraint. This was the moment where someone else might explode, might scream, "I wrote that bill," might slam their own hand on the table and demand recognition, or at the very least a little curiosity. But I didn't, because I wasn't raised to win dinner arguments. I was trained to hold fire until the shot mattered. The conversation moved on. Camden shifted the topic toward an op-ed he'd just written, and my mother started clearing plates. I stood and helped because that's what I'd always done, support from the edges. I stacked the dishes, rinsed them without speaking, listened to my father in the next room reciting quotes from James Madison like he personally knew him. I listened to Camden explain how law must be visible, traceable, and reasoned, and I swallowed the irony of hearing those words while the work I'd poured years into was being dismissed by people who weren't allowed to know I existed inside it. Later, as we lingered by the front door, coats in hand and the night winding down, Camden clapped me on the back. "You should read that bill if you haven't already," he said. "Might help you see why lawyers are still necessary." He grinned. I nodded. "Thanks. I'll take a look." He didn't mean it cruelly. He rarely did. But he still thought of me as someone hovering outside the real conversations, as if I were watching the game from the bleachers while he played on the field. But I wasn't in the bleachers. I was the one who wrote the playbook. As I drove away, I thought about how many times I'd sat in rooms full of brilliant people who would never be thanked. People who spent their entire careers shaping policy, redirecting threats, scrubbing logs, and shutting down attacks before the public even knew they existed. None of them had a byline. None of them made speeches. But they were the reason the lights stayed on. And tonight, that included me. You always miss the moments that matter. My mother didn't say it with anger. That would have been easier to bear. She said it with disappointment, the kind that coats the edges of every syllable like sugar on the rim of a bitter glass. Disappointment in her voice was a language all its own. The voicemail had come in just after 2 a.m. while I sat in the flickering light of a federal emergency coordination room 70 feet beneath Arlington, sipping lukewarm coffee and monitoring the red-hot pulse of a live threat moving across the northeastern quadrant of the United States. They had no idea what I was doing that night. They never did. Camden's speech had aired on 3 regional networks and C-SPAN. It was the keynote address for the State Bar's annual summit, a coveted slot, even for lawyers twice his age. My parents had dressed for the occasion like it was a wedding. My mother wore navy silk and pearls. My father dusted off his old robes from his bench days. Camden, of course, looked perfect. He always did. But I wasn't there. Because while he stood under chandeliers in a hotel ballroom downtown, thanking his mentors and speaking about building resilient civic institutions, I was deep inside a war room watching the firewall of a Level 1 trauma center in Philadelphia blink yellow, then red. The intrusion had started 3 hours earlier. Small probes, deliberate, targeted. Then they hit 4 more hospitals simultaneously: Boston, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. The goal wasn't to extract data. It was to destabilize critical infrastructure. If they succeeded, EHR's electronic health records would go dark, ventilator settings would freeze, and emergency dispatch systems would be knocked out in some of the busiest trauma centers in the region. We didn't have time for speeches. At 8:21 p.m., I authorized a cross-agency scrub and block directive across 2 states. At 9:07, I greenlit an untested protocol from a private contractor, a risk I would have to answer for later. At 10:13, we successfully isolated the compromised server cluster and cut off external access. By 10:27 p.m., the threat was neutralized. By 11:00, Camden had finished his speech and was posing for photos with the state's Chief Justice. By midnight, I was sitting in the break room of that bunker, surrounded by vending machines and old National Geographic magazines, listening to my mother's voice through the earpiece. "We're not asking for a lot, Seraphine. Just that you show up once in a while. You always say your work is important, but at some point, so is family. Camden notices. We all do." She didn't cry. Ramona Vale didn't cry over things like that. She rationed emotion the way wartime mothers rationed sugar. You got enough to keep things sweet, but never more than necessary. When I didn't respond, she ended the message with her usual sign-off, "We love you, even if we don't always understand you." I sat back, letting the silence take up space. I didn't want credit. I didn't even want thanks. I just didn't want to be accused of not caring when I'd spent every ounce of myself making sure people lived through the night. The next afternoon, I finally returned her call. I was back in my apartment, barely slept still in wrinkled clothes, waiting for another situation, brief from my team. "Hi, Mom," I said as soon as she answered. She didn't greet me. "We saved a seat for you," she said instead. "Front row, right next to us." "I know. You didn't even text." "I couldn't," I said carefully. "I was at work." "I figured. Another one of your emergencies." I didn't speak. She sighed. "Camden really wanted you there. He even mentioned you in his notes, had a line thanking you for always challenging him to think critically. He ended up cutting it when he realized you weren't coming. That hit harder than I expected. I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "But I really couldn't leave." My mother's voice softened, but not in the comforting way. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you use work as an excuse, a way to avoid us, a way to feel superior." I inhaled slowly through my nose. "Is that what you really think? I think you've always had a chip on your shoulder, Seraphine? Even as a child, like you needed to prove something the rest of us couldn't understand." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that I had proof, time-stamped logs, encrypted reports, hospital administrators who would never know my name but owed me their uninterrupted oxygen supply. I wanted to tell her that while Camden shook hands under a chandelier, I was approving countermeasures to keep patients breathing, but I didn't, because that was the cost. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing," I said instead, "even if you never see it." "I see someone who's never here," she said quietly. "That's what I see." We ended the call not long after both of us drifting into that polite silence that lives between daughters and mothers who no longer speak the same emotional dialect. That night, I pulled up Camden's speech online. I watched him smile, gesture articulate ideas about resilience and institutional trust with ease. He was good. He always had been. And in a different life, maybe I would have been there front row, clapping louder than anyone. But I wasn't. I was in a bunker, saving lives. Again. The smoke from the grill curled lazily through the backyard, catching the edge of my mother's wind chimes and spinning them into motion. The Saturday barbecue had been Camden's idea, a family recharge after his big speech and media blitz. He said it with that easy grin of his, the one that always made people feel like they were in on something important. The truth was, it wasn't really about recharging. It was a celebration, another step in his carefully plotted trajectory. The local paper had run a front-page spread on his remarks at the bar summit, and a clip from his speech had gone viral on legal Twitter. Someone even started calling him the young eagle of the East. I stood by the cooler, half listening to a circle of uncles and second cousins toss back beers and compliments. The sun was too bright, the lawn too trimmed, and the praise too familiar. "You see Camden on Channel 4, Uncle Ted asked, elbowing the guy next to him. "Talking about reforming municipal oversight, kids got it down. Whole generation's gonna owe him." My father nodded solemnly like the words were scripture. "He's already drafting proposals with the Attorney General's office. That's real impact." The conversation paused just long enough for someone to glance in my direction. "And what's Seraphine up to these days?" one cousin asked, clearly fishing. Before I could answer, Uncle Ted chuckled. "Still our little IT helper, huh? I got a printer that won't scan. Maybe she can take a look after dinner." Laughter. Light, harmless, easy. I smiled because that's what you do. Camden from his throne by the grill chimed in without missing a beat. "Don't worry, she's probably encrypting the charcoal. Or setting up two-factor authentication for the hot dogs. More laughter. I reached for a seltzer from the cooler. The ice bit into my fingers, which was good, it grounded me. To them, it was a harmless dig. A sibling jab, a family joke. But I felt the familiar weight settling into my ribs, the one that came from knowing every hour I spent monitoring national threats didn't add up to a single line of respect in their minds. It wasn't their fault, I told myself. How could they know everything I did was buried behind access walls and secure clearance? My accomplishments lived in sealed rooms and silent systems. My victories didn't come with trophies. They came with clean air, functioning water, and news reports that read, "No disruption expected." Camden flipped a burger with theatrical flair, drawing a fresh round of applause. "Let's give it up for our grill master/future senator," someone shouted. Someone else added, "And maybe he can write a law banning printer jams," which sent Uncle Ted into a fit. Meanwhile, I stood under the maple tree, sipping my lime seltzer, wondering if any of them even remembered that I'd graduated early, published my first encryption framework at 19, or helped write the cybersecurity protocols currently protecting the state's emergency response system. Probably not. My mother appeared beside me with a paper plate in hand. "You should talk to your Uncle Steve," she said gently. "He's been having issues with his home Wi-Fi. Maybe you can help." I turned toward her slowly. "Sure," I said. "After dessert." She smiled, relieved, and patted my shoulder like I was a good sport. Like I hadn't just agreed to play the role they'd already cast me in pleasant, technical, unthreatening. The sun dipped a little lower, turning the lawn gold. Kids ran through sprinklers. Someone turned on a Bluetooth speaker, and soft country music rolled across the yard. I watched as Camden took a selfie with 3 of our cousins, tagging it, "War, Family, and Public Service." One of them shouted to him, "Hey, that article said you might be advising federal policy next." Camden grinned. "Maybe so. You never know who's watching." And that's when I felt it, not just irritation, not just hurt, but that slow rising edge of sadness that starts deep in the chest. Because I was watching, always had been. Not just him, all of them. Watching, protecting, serving in ways they couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe even if I told them. I excused myself to the side gate, needing air. Quiet. Something real. I pulled out my phone, opened the secure line, and checked the system pings. 1 new flag, low severity. No immediate threat. Still, I made a mental note to follow up. As I stood under the fading sky, the back door creaked open. Camden stepped out holding a beer. He spotted me instantly. "Didn't mean to embarrass you earlier," he said, tone softer. "It's just a joke. You're good at what you do, whatever that is." "Whatever that is." I nodded. "It's fine. I mean, I know you're smart. Always have been. Dad used to say you were a calculator with legs." He laughed and I forced a smile. "Funny. I always thought he liked those calculators more than the person using them." Camden tilted his head. "Why don't you tell us more about your work if it's that important?" "Because I can't," I said. "It's classified." "You know that." "Right. Of course." He took a sip of his beer. "It's just hard to connect when everything's a secret." I didn't say anything. Because it wasn't just a secret. It was my identity, my silence, my contribution. The walls weren't mine. I just lived inside them. Camden looked away. "Anyway, we're lucky to have you, even if no one knows exactly why." And just like that, he walked back inside. I stared at the stars beginning to show in the deepening blue above and thought, maybe they didn't need to know. But I still wanted them to see me. The 4th of July began with sparklers and ended with silence. I was already 4 hours into the longest day of my year when my family fired up the grill. I'd skipped the lake trip, the matching shirts, the whole red, white, and blue pageantry they posted on Facebook. I was underground again, working 12 feet from a digital battlefield no one could see, let alone name. The chatter had started on secure channels 3 days earlier, encrypted whispers of an unusual pattern in Eastern European servers bots, masking as routine medical data pings. By the time we traced the anomaly, it was clear a massive coordinated strike was planned for Independence Day. The targets weren't symbolic. They were functional. Airports, freight systems, the National Blood Bank, even the Coast Guard's internal alert chain. It was bold, messy, and far too real. I barely blinked between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. as I helped coordinate one of the largest multi-agency defense sequences I'd ever led. By early evening, we confirmed successful neutralization. No systems fell, no alarms triggered. America kept grilling its burgers and lighting fireworks, never knowing it had nearly gone dark. I was still in the briefing room reviewing containment reports when my phone buzzed, first, once, then again, then 5 more times in rapid succession. Messages poured in. A ping from Dr. Vance Turn on the television. Channel 2. Now. I walked to the side office with the government-issued flat screen and flicked it on. The seal of the President of the United States filled the screen. And while many of our safeguards remain confidential, the President said, "I believe the American people deserve to know that what protected them today wasn't luck, it was leadership." I froze. She continued, voice calm and resolute. "There's a woman named Seraphine Vale. You've never seen her on TV. She doesn't have a podcast or a social media account. But she is the architect behind the digital protocols that protected our hospitals, our runways, and our children's safety this 4th of July. And tonight, I say her name with gratitude. We thank you, Ms. Vale." My breath caught. For one heartbeat, time stopped. The image cut to the President standing at the White House podium, fireworks still cracking in the distance behind her. I stared, motionless. I hadn't even known they were going to say anything publicly, let alone name me. My phone buzzed again, and again, and again. Somehow, despite all the walls and clearance levels and NDAs, the truth had slipped into the world like a match catching flame. And 22 miles away in the Vale family living room, they were watching it happen live. Ramona Vale dropped her wine glass. It hit the tiled floor of the sunroom with a sharp crack, the stem snapping clean. Red liquid splashed across her sandals. She didn't notice. Everett stood frozen in front of the TV, eyes narrowed, mouth slightly ajar. He didn't blink. Camden went pale. Visibly, unmistakably pale. "What did she just say?" Ramona whispered. Camden didn't respond. The President's speech was still playing, but no one heard it anymore. They were staring at the same name they'd tossed around casually for years, always in lowercase. Seraphine. The quiet one. The drifter. The tech girl. Everett finally spoke. "This has to be a mistake. Or some kind of symbolic gesture." She said her full name. Ramona replied, her voice barely audible. "First and last." Camden reached for his phone, pulling up Google, then stopped. What would he even search? "My sister is a national security architect." Ramona sat down hard on the couch, her hands trembling. Why didn't she tell us Everett's voice was sharp? Because someone doesn't put themselves in the spotlight when they're doing that kind of work. That's why. Camden finally broke the silence. She was in the room where it actually happens. Back in the command center, my inbox had collapsed. Agency heads, former classmates, the mayor's office. Even the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, my father's old acquaintance, had emailed proud to know your family, Seraphine. Your work saved lives. I sat there blinking, processing. I didn't want fame. God knows I didn't want this kind of exposure. But I felt something strange swelling in my chest. Not pride, exactly. Relief. Not because the world knew, but because my family did. I drove home late, past a city still lighting leftover fireworks, sparklers drawing smoky lines in the sky. I pulled into my building garage at 11:47 p.m., exhausted and unsure what to expect. There were 3 voicemails waiting on my phone. One from Camden. "Hey, we saw, just call me when you can." One from Ramona. "You should have told us. We were proud before. We just didn't know what we were proud of." And one from Everett. Just 2 words, "call me." I didn't sleep much that night, not because of the chaos, but because something tectonic had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just tolerated in the Vale family, I had entered the frame, on their television screen, in their world, under their name. The sun rose over a strangely quiet house. Not silence exactly, more like something had been removed. Like the piano in the front room was gone, but you could still feel where it used to be. I hadn't planned to visit so soon. I didn't even want to. But after the president named me on live television, the storm I'd avoided for years finally arrived. Front porch open arms questions loaded like rifles. Ramona had called 3 times before breakfast. Camden texted twice. No emojis, no jokes, just, "Are you okay?" Everett didn't message. He never did. Still, by 10:15 the next morning, I was standing in my parents' kitchen nursing a coffee that tasted more like nostalgia than caffeine. Everett paced, not a dramatic, angry pace, just enough to remind the room he was thinking, calculating. Ramona sat at the edge of a bar stool like her weight might offend it. Camden leaned against the counter with arms crossed, watching me like I was a puzzle he thought he'd already solved, but now couldn't find the edge pieces for. "You could have said something," Ramona finally said. Her voice was tight, not accusing, but too steady to be casual. "You let us believe you dropped out of MIT. You let your father think you were just freelancing with some startup." I nodded slowly. "Because if you'd known, the people trying to crash our country might have known too." Everett stopped pacing. "That's dramatic." "No, I said that's operational security." Camden cleared his throat. "Wait, so all the times you missed birthdays, skipped holidays, left early without explanation, that was because of work, national security work?" "Yes, and you couldn't tell us anything, not without risking exposure. Even my presence at certain public events was monitored. When I went to Uncle Jeremy's retirement party 2 years ago, that alone took 3 weeks of clearance and relocation of an unrelated asset on the guest list." Everett scoffed. "And we're supposed to believe you've been playing spy games this whole time while we sat around thinking you were fixing routers." My gaze sharpened. "I didn't say I was a spy. I said I worked in defense architecture. Not every battlefield uses bullets." He crossed his arms, unconvinced. "You hid from us. Not for the country, for yourself." That stung. "I didn't hide," I said quietly. "I followed the rules I was given, and I made peace with the idea that if I did my job right, no one would ever thank me. No one would even know." Ramona leaned forward. "But we're your family. That's exactly why I kept you out of it." Camden rubbed the back of his neck, silent. His eyes were darker than usual, less smug, more uncertain. Everett's tone sharpened. "You think you're the only one with responsibility. I carried cases that put people away for life. I made rulings that shaped state law. I've had to hold information too." "I know you have," I said. "But you also got the podium, the recognition, the narrative." "I didn't get that option." Ramona interrupted. "But now that it's out there, what happens next? Are you done? Are you safe?" I hesitated. "I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen." That speech, it wasn't cleared through my usual chain. My name was never meant to be public. Everett narrowed his eyes. "So now what you get paraded around. Suddenly our last name becomes a headline. That's not what we signed up for." My voice stayed steady. Neither did I. There was a pause, a long one. You could hear the refrigerator hum the light wind against the window pane, even the quiet buzz of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Then Camden stepped forward. "You built all that. And you let us think you were wasting your potential." I looked at him. Because it wasn't about potential. It was about protection. That's what I chose. Every day. Even when it meant you mocked me. Even when Dad dismissed me. Everett didn't flinch, but he didn't speak either. Ramona's voice cracked. "You were alone through all that." I nodded once. "Mostly." Camden's arms dropped to his sides. "I don't know whether to apologize or ask for more details." "You can't have more details," I said gently. "But you can stop assuming I'm something smaller than I am." That hung in the air. The woman they thought they knew, quiet, odd, distant, was still me. But now I wasn't a background blur in Camden's highlight reel. I wasn't the afterthought at Thanksgiving. I was someone they had to recalibrate around. Ramona stood slowly and walked toward me. For a second I thought she might hug me. Instead, she reached up and brushed a piece of lint off my sleeve. "Well," she said, her voice wobbling, "I guess I need to Google some new vocabulary." I smiled. You probably won't find much. Camden exhaled half laugh, half sigh. You know what's ironic? What? He tilted his head. You're the only one who actually followed the law to the letter. You just couldn't tell anyone about it. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Because maybe for the first time they saw it. Not just the resume or the clearance level. They saw me. And even if it came decades late and a president had to break protocol to make it happen, it was finally enough. Camden leaned back in his office chair, staring at the document on his laptop screen. His speech was due in 20 hours, a keynote on digital infrastructure accountability for the National Civic Law Symposium. It was the kind of polished, high-profile platform he excelled at. But tonight, his confidence wavered. He scrolled through the draft again. The flow was solid. The arguments were tight. He'd spent the better part of 3 days threading in references to the landmark Cyber Infrastructure Act, the very bill that had put Seraphine's name into national headlines just a week ago. But something caught his eye. In the margins of the second draft, where he'd annotated a line about real-time asset mobilization, he saw a note use Blue Book 21.4 for agency citations. Include source timestamp. It wasn't his note. Not in style, not in tone. And more than that, it was familiar. Very familiar. He recognized the phrasing because he had learned it from someone. Years ago. Back when he was 15 and wrestling with citation formats for his Model UN brief, Seraphine had sat beside him, walked him through Blue Book examples line by line, and marked his drafts with nearly identical reminders. She'd even drawn a star next to the timestamp rule because, in her words, future lawyers forget that time matters most when you're defending the truth. He blinked. No way. He clicked over to the original version of the bill that had been circulated in advisory notes, then pulled up a version from the legal backend database where drafts were stored with metadata. His access wasn't perfect. He wasn't cleared for classified archives, but some layers had recently been made visible after the president's speech. There it was. In the version history, a redacted author code he didn't recognize. But the formatting, the structuring, the logic of the provisions. It sounded like Seraphine, quietly precise. Unflashy, but airtight. He didn't even realize he'd stood up until he found himself in his car, driving toward her apartment. Seraphine answered the door in black joggers and a soft blue hoodie. No makeup. Hair pinned back. She looked tired, but calm. Like someone who'd gotten used to running at a higher frequency than the rest of the world. Camden didn't waste time. That clause in Section 3 about asset escalation, he said, stepping inside. The legal trigger language. That's yours, isn't it? She raised an eyebrow. You drove across the city to ask me that? Yes. She didn't deny it. Camden let out a slow breath. How long have I been quoting my sister in speeches and had no idea? She gave a faint smile. Longer than you'd guess. I thought I was the changemaker in the family, he said quietly. You are, she replied. But we're in different battles. He moved to the small kitchen island, his voice softer. Why use language I taught you? Seraphine blinked, surprised. You didn't teach it to me. We learned it together. Remember when you made me read the Federalist Papers with you? He laughed once. Yeah. You got bored after page 20. No, I memorized them. I just didn't want to debate you about it for 6 hours. Camden shook his head, still trying to connect the version of his sister he'd teased for drifting with the one whose policy had just become federal standard. I wish I'd known, he said. No, you don't, Seraphine replied. Because if you'd known, you would have had to pretend not to. You would have lied to Dad. And you're too honest for that. He didn't argue, because she was right. Camden reached for one of the index cards sitting on her table notes for a classified debrief she'd never be allowed to speak publicly. He turned it over. You're good, he said. Really good. Seraphine gave a small shrug. You're the one who got the speech slot. I just wrote the scaffolding. He looked up. You're not bitter. No, she said. Because if the law works, it doesn't matter whose voice carried it into the room. What matters is that it stands. For the first time since the night of the president's speech, something shifted between them. Not just understanding, but mutual recognition. Camden nodded more to himself than her. "You've been in the room all along." She leaned back against the counter. "Just not the one with the cameras." He grinned, but it faded quickly. "What does Dad say now?" "He hasn't said much," Seraphine replied. "He's processing, or preserving pride." "Hard to tell." Camden smirked. "He's probably reading every footnote in that bill, hoping to find a typo." "I made sure there weren't any," she said. He laughed. "Of course you did." A silence settled, not awkward, just real. Then he added, "You know what I admire most about it? What you wrote something strong enough to carry the weight of a country, and quiet enough that it never asked for applause." Seraphine looked at him for a long beat. "Thank you." He walked to the door, pausing before he left. "The keynote's at the Capitol next week. You won't be in the program, but you'll be in every word I say." She nodded. "That's more than enough." And for the first time in years, Camden didn't feel like the only veil carrying the family name with power. He'd just learned who built the platform he'd been standing on all along. The ballroom was colder than expected. Not freezing, but cold enough that every breath came out a little tighter. Every exhale fogged the surface of your nerves. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I stepped through the side entrance, bypassing the photographers stationed out front. There wouldn't be pictures of me from tonight. Not officially. The gala was billed as the Eastern Civic Defense Forum, a bland name for an evening gathering of some of the most powerful minds in digital infrastructure law and national security policy. The public only knew the event featured a panel on resilience in cyber legislation. The real reason half of Washington was here, to hear the quiet architect behind the July 4th firewall stand at a podium for the first time. Me. My name wasn't in the program. Just a blank space, a placeholder. It had to be that way. Too much visibility too soon risked back-channel targeting, but tonight, the agencies signed off 20 minutes one microphone closed cameras. I stood backstage while the panel moderator read a carefully vetted introduction. Our next speaker was instrumental in stabilizing the digital backbone of our emergency systems during recent events. Though you may not know her face, her fingerprints are on every line of national protocol adopted this year. My cue light blinked. I walked out. No music, no applause. Just soft silence and the weight of more eyes than I'd ever felt before. Somewhere near the back of the room, Everett Vale adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and stood a little taller. He was a guest of the state judiciary circle, technically retired, but still invited to every major policy event. He hadn't said he was coming. I found out the night before from Camden. He said only Dad's not talking much, but he's watching everything. After I spoke, outlining the framework behind the July defense structure, threading policy into practical application, I stepped down and made my way toward the back, trying not to think about the 100 conversations buzzing in the wake of my departure from the podium. I didn't expect to see him standing there. Everett was mid-discussion with a man in a charcoal gray suit, Judge Leonard Wexler, one of his old friends from the federal circuit. They spoke in low tones, heads bent slightly, the kind of exchange that never needed full sentences. And then Everett turned. His eyes met mine. He didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't scowl. He simply said with calm clarity, "Leonard, this is my daughter Seraphine. She rewrote how we protect America's future." Time didn't slow down, it stopped. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. No qualifiers, no dismissive shrug. No, she does tech stuff or she works somewhere digital. Just my name and a sentence that felt like legacy. Leonard turned, surprised. "The keynote was yours," he asked me, offering his hand. "That was genuinely extraordinary." I shook it. "Thank you. It's an evolving framework. We're still hardening key sectors." He chuckled. "You sound just like Everett used to at your age, only he was talking about tort law." Everett let out a small laugh, not his usual forced courtesy, something looser. Real. He didn't apologize. Not for years of dismissing my work, not for saying I'd drifted, not for comparing my career path to Camden's like I was a placeholder in a bigger story. But he didn't have to. Not tonight. His presence beside me, his use of the word daughter, was something I hadn't known I'd longed for until I heard it out loud. I stayed for only an hour longer, spoke with 2 agency heads, deflected 3 interview requests, avoided a photographer from the Chronicle who tried to sneak a picture. I declined the after-party. As I slipped out through the side corridor, I passed Camden. He raised his glass slightly and said just one word: finally. Later that night, back in my apartment, I stared at the city from my window. Below, fireworks lingered from a late-night sports win, white bursts flickering against office towers. I thought about the version of me who once believed silence was safety, that every achievement had to be hidden to matter. That recognition meant exposure, and exposure meant danger. But something had shifted. My name didn't just belong in sealed reports or classified margins anymore. It had been spoken by the president, quoted by my brother, and tonight it had been claimed by my father, not for status, not for vanity, but with pride. No cameras, no microphone, just a simple sentence at the back of a crowded room. A man who had once measured success in court decisions and courtroom decorum had finally acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, the daughter who never wore a robe or passed the bar had done something worth standing beside. He said I rewrote how we protect America's future, but what he really rewrote without knowing it was something else entirely: how I belonged in this family. There had always been a family photo on the hallway wall, taken at a 4th of July picnic when I was 20 and still pretending to be a college dropout. In the original frame, I was there, but barely. Off to the side, half-cropped, smiling into the sun, but clearly not centered. The Vale family image had always revolved around other people: my father's towering presence, Camden's polished certainty, my mother's curated perfection. I was the extra, the blur at the edge. But this morning, I paused in the hallway when I saw it. The photo was different. Same day, same moment. But now it had been reprinted, reframed, and I was in the center. My mother had placed it beside a new arrangement on the console table, a small navy blue shadow box with a modest, tasteful label beneath it: Seraphine Vale, Service Recognition National Infrastructure Defense Unit. It wasn't classified. Just one of the public commendations released quietly by the Office of Cyber Defense after the president's speech. There was a second folder tucked beneath it, partially visible, what looked like an op-ed from a legal journal quoting a portion of my policy brief. Nothing showy, just presence. Ramona walked into the hallway holding a laundry basket. She saw me looking. "I found the unedited photo," she said. "I always liked this one better. You're squinting, but it's honest." I turned to her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. Then after a pause, "But I wanted to." She didn't try to explain further. She didn't need to. At dinner that week, no one asked me to fix a printer. No one called me the tech girl. Camden brought up a quote from one of my recent white papers during a policy discussion, casually attributing it. As Seraphine pointed out in her infrastructure matrix, we don't need more firewalls, we need smarter exits. Everett nodded. It's an elegant way of framing resilience. Modular fallback versus brute force defense. I nearly dropped my fork. Ramona passed me the salad without correcting how I held the tongs. Camden even paused before launching into a story about a senator's latest blunder. "You've probably seen the draft memos, right?" he asked me. "Or at least the back-channel warnings I blinked. You think I get briefed on Senate antics?" He grinned. "I think you get briefed on things that would make the Senate cry." I didn't deny it. It wasn't a dramatic change. No fireworks, no teary apologies. Just more listening, fewer assumptions. Like when Everett and I both reached for the remote during a news segment, and for the first time ever he said, "You probably know more about this than I do," and handed it to me without a second thought. Or when Camden posted a tweet after a panel event, grateful to my sister Seraphine Vale, whose framework taught me how to draft laws that actually hold under pressure. It had 47,000 likes by the next morning. I didn't ask for that, but I screenshotted it anyway. A week later, a woman from the Department of Veterans Affairs called my office. She'd seen my name in a recent case study on cybersecurity reform and wanted to know if I could speak unofficially to a group of veterans transitioning into tech roles. I checked my calendar. It was already full. I made time anyway, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just invisible labor behind the firewall. I was seen. Not fully understood, but seen. That was enough. One evening, I came home to find a box on my doorstep. No label. Just my name in clean handwriting. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was the first model I ever built a primitive circuit board from when I was 16, still faintly scorched on the edge where I'd accidentally melted a resistor. I'd thought it was lost. Underneath it was a note in my father's hand. You were never lost. You were building maps we didn't know how to read. Sometimes I still walk into a room and feel the old script creeping in, the one that told me I didn't belong, that I was odd, too quiet, too technical, too other. But then I hear Camden quote me without irony. I see Ramona setting out extra place settings like she expects me to show up. I catch Everett reading through my most recent brief with a highlighter and margin notes. And I know the truth. They used to say I was lost. Now they say she leads from places we can't always follow, but we trust her to take us somewhere worth going. The mahogany-paneled conference room at the Hartwell Institute smelled faintly of old paper and polished shoes, exactly the way Everett Vale liked it. It was the kind of DC roundtable where introductions didn't need resumes because everyone already knew everyone's weight in legislation. Or at least they used to. This time, Everett found himself one step behind the conversation. They weren't discussing law reviews or case precedents. They were talking about architecture, not steel, not buildings, digital, invisible structures holding up the entire country. And they kept mentioning one name, Seraphine. Everett didn't speak right away. He sat back sipping his black coffee as a rear admiral from Navy Cyber Command leaned into the group. Frankly, the admiral said if it hadn't been for her team's counterloop last quarter, we'd still be running silent recovery on our northern drone relay systems. She caught it 2 days before escalation. Someone else Air Force, judging by the lapel pin, added, "She's a ghost. Doesn't take credit. Doesn't show up in photos. But make no mistake, she's one of ours." Everett's hand paused on the mug handle. The admiral must have noticed. "You look like you know her." Everett cleared his throat. "Seraphine Vale. She's my daughter." The admiral's eyebrows rose. "Well, Judge Vale, you should be proud. She's rare. And not just in brains, in instinct. There aren't many people we trust with system-wide autonomy. She's one of them." Everett nodded once, unsure if the heat rising in his chest was pride or shame. Maybe both. He didn't stay for the rest of the session. The walk back to his office was brisk, not because of urgency, but because memory had a pace of its own when it started to sting. He thought about the times he'd rolled his eyes when Seraphine left family events early, the Thanksgivings she missed entirely, the birthdays she sent brief emails for instead of calls. He thought about the casual dismissals the way he'd framed her work as tinkering or system support when people asked. How many times had he said she's smart, but not really in public-facing work like that was something to apologize for? And he remembered painfully clearly the time Camden gave a speech in the State House, and Everett had cried, not because of the words, but because of what it meant to have a legacy carried forward. He hadn't cried for Seraphine, not once. Not until now. That night, he sat at his desk in his study, the house empty except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the hardwood floors. He opened the bottom drawer where he kept old legal pads back when he used to draft opinions longhand before typing them. He pulled one out, wrote without thinking. When he finished, he folded the page, slid it into a blank envelope, and drove 3 blocks through quiet Capitol Hill streets. Her apartment building was dark, except for one light glowing faintly from what he guessed was her kitchen. He didn't ring the bell. He simply placed the envelope at her door and left. The next morning, Seraphine opened it. No card, no date. Just one piece of paper in her father's firm, familiar handwriting legacy isn't loud. It's what remains after silence. She read it 3 times. Once as a daughter, once as an analyst, once as someone who no longer needed to be explained to be seen. She placed it in the back of her passport folder between a briefing on ransomware evolution and her old MIT acceptance letter. It didn't need to be on display. She just needed to know it was real. The stage lights were warmer than she expected. Not blinding, not theatrical, just golden soft against her skin as she stepped forward into the hush of 1,000 people standing to applaud. For a moment, Seraphine didn't breathe. The crowd rose before her, not in thunderous chaos, but in that rare kind of reverent unity usually reserved for astronauts or Nobel winners. These were not her people, not in the day-to-day sense, not the quiet analysts or coders in anonymous offices, not the agents who moved through shadowed networks. This was the public face of recognition-elected officials, agency directors, foreign dignitaries. And down in the front row, her family. Everett, in a charcoal suit hands, clasped, expression unreadable, but he was standing. Ramona beside him, eyes glassy but proud. Camden, arms folded, chin lifted slightly, giving her a subtle nod that said, "You're here. You earned this." And she had. The presenter stepped aside as she reached the podium, and for a second, just a beat, there was complete silence. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Seraphine placed her hands on the edge of the lectern. No papers, no teleprompter. Just her voice. Visibility. She began her tone clear, low, steady is a privilege. She let that hang. Not everyone who shapes the world is meant to be seen doing it. Some of us build beneath the surface, not for applause, but for the structure, the foundation. She looked toward the crowd, not scanning for faces, just anchoring her words. Infrastructure, digital or otherwise, only matters if it holds under pressure. That's the kind of legacy I was raised to believe in. Quiet, durable, necessary. A pause, not for drama, for breath. I wasn't always understood. I wasn't always believed. But I was always building. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that impact doesn't require a spotlight. She shifted slightly, voice softening. Tonight, I accept this on behalf of everyone who's ever worked unseen, whose fingerprints are on the bridges, codes, policies, and protections that hold up the country, but never make the front page. A final breath. We don't need to be visible to matter. But tonight, I'm grateful to be both. She stepped back. The applause came again, this time softer but longer, like a wave breaking gently across the room. Backstage, her hands finally began to tremble, adrenaline releasing slowly now that the moment was behind her. Camden was the first to reach her. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped her in a hug that was firmer than it needed to be and lingered longer than it usually did. Then, Ramona, who wiped under her eyes and said, "You looked like yourself up there." "I was myself up there?" Seraphine replied, half laughing. And then, Everett. He didn't hug her, didn't shake her hand. He just stood in front of her, looked her in the eye, and said low enough that only she could hear, "You didn't follow in my footsteps. You made your own." It was the only thing he could have said that would have mattered, because it wasn't praise. It was recognition, and for someone who had spent a lifetime building structures others depended on but never noticed, that kind of acknowledgement was louder than any standing ovation. Later that night, after the gala, Seraphine returned home alone. Not lonely, just full. Her phone buzzed texts from colleagues, quiet congratulations, one from a former boss with a string of celebratory emojis she didn't expect but appreciated. She poured a glass of water, placed the award, simple understated medal, on her shelf next to the one photograph she'd kept framed from childhood. The same one Ramona had reprinted weeks earlier. She looked at it now, Camden and Everett mid-laugh, her mother's eyes squinting in sunlight, and Seraphine no longer cropped at the edge but in the center. Not because the story changed, but because they finally saw it differently. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened her journal, the one she kept hidden under the bookshelf, filled with notes and thoughts never shared with anyone. And she wrote, "I didn't need to be a disappointment to be seen." She closed the book, turned off the light, and for the first time in years, she went to bed not wondering if the world would ever know her name, but knowing she didn't need them to, because the people who mattered now did, and that was enough.